All right, we've spent a little time defining terms. And again, this is a discussion about tribes of the Great Plains. Next big term that we're going to have to define is Great Plains or plains. First of all, the region in North America known as the Great Plains is this region here in the sort of reddish magenta hue that cuts kind of through the center of the continental United States up into southern Canada. And generally, it's divided into the northern plains and the southern plains. So here I have a map overlaid on the other map, just to give you an idea. You probably could have guessed that the southern plains were in the south, toward the bottom. But this is roughly where the cutoff is. Now, this little extra add-on map that I put on is not entirely accurate because the darker parts of the brown there, that's not plains. All of Texas isn't in the Great Plains. East Texas, the farther you go east, it borders Louisiana. It's not that different from Louisiana, and the coastal area is very different. But you can see here Texas, parts of New Mexico, most of Oklahoma, at least especially western Oklahoma. And the cutoff there, according to this map, would be right there in the middle of Kansas. So everything north of that would be then northern plains. Sometimes you will see Kansas and Nebraska, just to the north of Kansas, referred to as the Central Plains. So there's northern, southern, and central. But generally speaking, particularly in these discussions, we're going to be talking about northern and southern plains. And the cultures are very, very similar of the Native American tribes who were occupying these areas when Europeans arrived. But there are some differences between north and south, which we will get into. Well, here is yet another map showing the general location of the various tribes of the plains. And again, this is as of the 1800s, roughly. You can see there's quite a few on there. Some of them you may have heard of before, maybe some of them you had not. Here is another map that shows the same thing with a little bit of context because you can see the whole country. And Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara are in larger font here. And that may have been because this was a map talking about the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa. But to be fair, in the 1700s, late 1700s, those three tribes, which were allied, kind of dominated trade in the northern plains. So this also shows not just the plains themselves, but what I call plains adjacent areas, or plains contiguous, but adjacent probably sounds better. That some of those areas include some of those areas east of the Mississippi that are not technically plains but are prairie, but have some cultural interactions, certainly, and some similarities. And here we're talking about parts of a large part of Arkansas and most of Missouri and Iowa and a big part of Minnesota. All right. Well, that is how things stood as of the 1800s, but it was significantly different from how the region was occupied at the time of European arrivals. So let's take a look at how things stood circa 1492, the arrival of Columbus in those Caribbean islands. And all these tribes that are scattered across the map are the ones which in that earlier map were all in the plains area. So as you can see, before European arrival, they most of those tribes that we looked at before were not on the plains. The ones who were included the Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara in the north, and the Pawnee in eastern Nebraska, the Wichita, and down in the south, the Taos and Tonkawas. The ones that are in the northern plains area there, Hidatsa, Mandana, Arikara, Pawnee are along the banks of the Missouri River, which was, a fertile area. And so these were farming agricultural tribes that had ventured out. Some of them had been there for a very, very long time. I shouldn't say ventured out, but which were there in the areas where it was possible to do farming. Once you got, the farther west that you went, the drier it was, which means that farming was very, very difficult, if not impossible. Very little water. There were herds of buffalo that were there wandering the plains. But for a tribal group to basically sustain themselves on buffalo was difficult without horses. It's hard to run down a buffalo herd on foot, although there were ways to do it, which we will look at, that some people did do. But at this time, without horses, it was, with the climate as it was in the 16th, 17th century, just not that practical. Things are going to change, and more of these groups that are spread out here are going to come onto the plains, as indicated in this map. Now, the ones with the black arrows, the Ponca, Iowa, or Iowa, Oto, Omaha, and Missouri, are the ones that they came from the Missouri and Illinois area, closer to the Mississippi River, out onto the eastern part of the plains. And most of them also were agricultural. Then you've got the buffalo nomads. That's the ones with, it's really hard for me to see what color those lighter colored arrows are, kind of brownish. But once horses were a thing for Indians after the arrival of the Spanish, and various tribes had access to horses, many of them then moved on to the plains and began that nomadic buffalo hunting lifestyle. And that's maybe some of the ones that you have heard of and perhaps associate with the plains, but actually came from other areas, like the Comanche. Had originally been part of the Shoshone. They spoke a Shoshonean language, and they came down from the area there in Utah and Idaho and so forth, and made their way south. The Lakota or Sioux actually had previously been in northern Minnesota by the Great Lakes, as had the Cheyenne been in the Great Lakes area, and they moved out onto the plains. You'll notice there's one particular group here, the Apache, that don't move onto the plains. They actually move off of the plains, and that's because they were there on the edge of the Great Plains. Some small groups of Apaches remained on the plains, but most of them were driven out by the Comanches when they arrived. So a lot of stuff, a lot of people in motion, which was, what tended to happen. And that process was greatly sped up with the arrival of horses. And then it was also kind of sped up with the arrival of guns, particularly when some tribes got guns and or horses before others. All right, well, now let's take a look at this map. This is a map not specifically necessarily of the plains, although the plains are included. It's a map of the grasslands. All right, so plains are flat areas that have, often have grass, don't necessarily even have to have grass, could just be sort of like tundra almost. But that are mostly treeless. Okay, that's the plains. Prairies can be on a plain. Prairies are very lush. It's areas where grass dominates. It's mostly grass, but there are also other things like trees and shrubs and flowering plants and so forth. Looking at this map, there are 4 basic types of grasslands. You've got the biggest area there, the green, darker green, the tall grass prairie. And as you can see, that is right up on the edge and slightly into the plains area. And most of Nebraska is this type of tall grass prairie. And also on the other side of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River there comes along, not on the other side of the Mississippi, on this side of the Mississippi, but out there into the areas like Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, and a large part of Minnesota. So you've got the tall grass prairie, and then you've got in the upper left, the sort of yellowish, that's the northern mixed. So let's take a look at the area that's kind of a light tan. You can barely see it on this map. It's over there to the left of all the greens and just south of the yellows, and that's that area there in eastern Colorado, northern Texas, a little bit of New Mexico, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and the westernmost part of Kansas. That's called the short grass steppe. So I have the pictures here so you can get an idea. On the steppes, that short grass area, you will only find trees along rivers or creeks. In these other areas, trees are a lot sparser, a lot harder to find than they are in the prairie areas, but you can find clumps of them. So you've got the long grass, that's the big area, and you've got the short grass there in the westernmost part, mostly in the south. Then you've got the northern mixed, that's kind of, they got tall grass, they got short grass, and then the southern mixed, which also has a mixture of different types of grasses, but has a slightly different look and feel to it. So here, 4 pictures of grass to help give an idea of what I'm talking about. Although the difference between the long grass area and the short grass steppes, I kind of picture in my mind because I'm a pop culture person and because I like westerns and frontier type movies and TV shows. I think in terms of the openings of 2 different things. The opening credits of Little House on the Prairie, which some of you may have seen, which was a TV show based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Ingalls Wilder. The TV show was set in Minnesota. And it opens up with this shot of this hillside that's got tall grass. And then the little girls come running over the top of the hill. So you can see there's some trees there, there's some flowering plants, and there's tall grass. For the short grass steppe, I think of High Plains Drifter. The short grass area is also called the High Plains. And this is, if you've ever seen this Clint Eastwood movie, which is truly bizarre. It's actually a ghost story. The mysterious figure kind of disappears, or kind of appears mysteriously out of this lake you can see in the distance, and kicking up a lot of dust. Not quite desert, but certainly not very lush and very, very flat. So that's what grasslands really are. Grasslands you can find in every continent except Antarctica. And they are areas where there's not enough rainfall to sustain forests. Maybe a few trees here and there, but not a whole forest. There's just not enough rain. But there is enough rain to sustain a lot of grass. So it's kind of in between forest and desert. And usually it literally is in between big forested areas and deserts, one on one side, one on the other. And here is another map showing the different types of grasses. A little bit different from the other map. All these things, I mean, it's not like county lines that are drawn up. In fact, over time, some of these things can shift, but it's enough to give us the general idea of what we're talking about. Okay, now let's take a look at rainfall and climate, which I had previously mentioned. This map here shows the plains. The plains are kind of that area in between the green and the orange, kind of brownish orange. That's kind of a tan color. That is the area where there is between, well, less than 25 inches of rain per year. Now the dark red over there, that is the where the Mojave Desert, Death Valley, and so forth. They get 5 inches or less of rain per year. And then the blue up in the northwest there around Seattle, they get 80 to 120 inches of rain per year. Here east of the Mississippi, and this includes, of course, Tennessee, where we are. Let's take a closer look at this scale here. You can see that for the most part, those areas east of the Mississippi are the areas that get somewhere between 50 to 80 to 80 inches of rain per year. So the plains, you're hitting that area where it's about the light green, that the plains adjacent areas I talked about. It's like 25 to 30, or 30 to 35, 25 to 30 inches. But you get out into that manila color, and that's where it's 20 to 25 inches of rain per year. As you can see, not surprisingly, the northern plains are cooler and the southern plains are hotter. As a result, the northern plains have a shorter growing season. The southern plains have a longer one. Let's take a look at rivers. I had mentioned the Missouri River earlier. That's the dominant river in the plains region. The Mississippi kind of, bifurcates or divides the east and the west. But there in the west, these are the major rivers along the plains. The Platte, the Yellowstone, the Missouri, again, being the most prominent and biggest one. Next, we're going to talk about sort of the prehistory of the area. We're going to go back thousands and thousands of years before there were humans in the area, and then the earliest humans. Before we do that, I want to talk about, I guess you could say terms, again, kind of similar to what I said earlier about mythology and cosmology. There are native traditions about about cosmogony, the creation of the universe, about where people came from, how the land was, and etc. And there is what we know through science. And what we know a lot of times is partly known, and part of it is extrapolation from what we know. And what I want to warn you about is that there's a tendency among many of us to take a look at the science, the anthropology, the archaeology, and say, okay, this is what happened, and the tradition may say something completely different, and we completely disregard it. But the fact is that various theories about the arrival of humans and things like that can change over time as more information is learned. So it's not set in stone. Sometimes it turns out that it's closer to the traditions than maybe people would have thought. So all this is, in essence, for me to say, let's be respectful of the various native groups' traditions and cosmogony and cosmologies, and look at that, and then also look at what the science is able to tell us, and try to put together a story as best we can. All right, so let's go.